Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of RUNTALK with Dr. Jason. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. On today's show, we're going to talk about something that is very misunderstood, interval training. Interval training has been something I've been in love with for a very long time, ever since I started running when I was in 6th grade. But it's very misunderstood. A lot of people don't use interval training very well. And today's show, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're trying to broadcast this both on Facebook and Instagram. But if you have questions, try to ask your questions through Instagram, since that is the major basis for which we're using. But we're also trying to broadcast this live on Facebook as well. So if you're on Facebook, thanks for joining us. And of course, if you're on Instagram, thank you for joining us. So in today's show, we're going to talk about interval training. So interval training, even though a lot of run coaches and runners and people in the fitness industry like to think that interval training is fairly new, it's not new at all. It's been used by runners since the early 1900s, and there have been some athletes over the years who have made it more popular, but it was actually first studied as a method of training back in the 1930s by a physiologist and coach over in Germany. Back then it was East Germany. Hans Reindl and Waldemar Gerschler. And the whole idea behind interval training was what it does for your cardiovascular system. The reason it's called interval training is because of what happens during the interval in between periods of running. So a lot of people talk about interval training, they refer to the periods of hard work, the periods of running. But interval training, the interval actually refers to the periods of running. And the whole concept is that you run hard for a period of time, maybe a minute or 2 minutes, and your oxygen consumption increases and your heart rate increases. And then when you rest in between the periods of hard running, there's something that pretty impressive that happens to the cardiovascular system. You stop running and the VO2, because of the demand, decreases, the heart rate drops, and the oxygen consumption, the VO2, drops. But during the rest interval, even though the demand has decreased, you have this enormous amount of blood returning back to the right side of the heart. The left side of the heart is responsible for pumping blood out everywhere in the body except the lungs. And then the right side of the heart is responsible for pumping blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen and dispel carbon dioxide. And so when you stop running, after running for a period of time that's hard, and you stop running, you have this enormous amount of blood flow back to the right side of the heart, and that's called the venous return. And so the venous return increases during the recovery or rest interval. But because you have a slowing heart rate, the heart rate is now decreasing because you stopped running. So because you have a slowing heart rate, but you have this huge amount of blood being dumped into the right side of the heart, and then eventually from the right side of the heart to the left side of the heart, because the venous return increases, but you have a slowing heart rate, that gives more time for the left ventricle of the heart for the blood to dump inside the left ventricle of the heart. And so the container, the left ventricle, will hold more blood. And if it holds more blood, it can subsequently pump more blood with each beat. So imagine the situation. You run hard for a period of time, you have all this blood flow going to the muscles, and then you stop running to recover, and you have this enormous amount of blood coming back up to the heart with a slowing heart rate. So doesn't that allow more time for more blood to enter that chamber? Yes, it does. Great, I'm glad you answered the question correctly. And so because you have a slowing heart rate, but more blood being entered into that chamber, then with each subsequent beat of the heart, you get a larger stroke volume. And so stroke volume, which is so important to distance running performance, because stroke volume is the volume of blood pumped by the heart per beat, and you multiply that by heart rate, and you get cardiac output, the volume of blood being pumped out of the heart per minute. And so the way the interval training was first, I don't want to say discovered, but the way it was first studied back in the 1930s was to look at what's happening to the heart's performance, the stroke volume, in between the periods of running. And so Hans Reindl and Waldemar Gerschler at Freiburg University in Germany decided to call this an interval workout or interval training because the emphasis of the workout is what happens to stroke volume in between the periods of work, the interval between periods of work. And so that's how we get this thing called interval training. So that gives you a little bit of the history. And then there have been some athletes along the way who really popularized it, like Emil Zatopek in the 1950s, late 1940s, early 1950s, when he was so successful at the Olympics in 1948, and then he won the 5K, 10K marathon at the 1952 Olympics. And so he really popularized interval training because people wanted to know, well, why was he so successful? What was he doing? And he did a very high volume of interval training, believing that if you do a high volume of interval training, that it improves endurance, it improves stamina. And so he was very successful. And there have been other athletes along the years that have been very successful with interval training. And so they really popularized Gershler and Reindell's work in the 1930s. But a lot of runners misunderstand interval training and how it's used. And so there are a couple of principles, or more than a couple. There's a few different principles about interval training to understand how to use it to improve your performance. The one concept is to run only as slow as you need to meet the purpose of the workout. And so there's a lot behind that comment. And so I'll spend some time explaining what that means. That if you say you want to improve your VO2 max, or you want to improve your lactate threshold, whatever physiological factor you're trying to improve with that workout, because interval training can be very effective for specifically targeting physiological factors that influence performance, influence fitness. And so if you want to improve VO2 max, let's just use that as an example. If you want to improve VO2 max during an interval workout, then you want to run at the intensity or the speed that elicits VO2 max, that causes you to reach VO2 max during the reps of the interval workout. So let's just use some easy math, because I'm going live. It's hard to do math when you're in public going live. So let's use some easy math. Let's say your VO2 max pace, the pace that's going to cause you to reach your VO2 max, let's just say that is 6-minute mile pace. That's, what is that, 3:45, I think it is, per kilometer, if you think in terms of kilometers. I think that's 3:45 per kilometer, 6 minutes per mile. You would do the reps, however long you make the reps. If you make them 3 minutes long, let's just pick it, makes the math easy. Let's say you're going to do half mile or 800 meter reps at VO2 max pace. So if your VO2 max pace is 6 minutes per mile, then you would do a half mile or 800 meters if you're on the track, 800 meter reps in 3 minutes each. That's all you need to do to reach your VO2 max. So if you can reach your VO2 max running 3 minutes per half mile or per 800 meters, then don't run them in 2:55. Because if you run them in 2:55, you're also going to reach your VO2 max. But the point is to run only as slow as you need, or only as fast as you need, to meet the purpose of the workout. So if 3 minutes meets the purpose of the workout, then why run each half mile or 800 meters in 2:55? Then you're just running faster for no extra benefit. You don't need to run faster than VO2 max to improve VO2 max. You only need to run at or very close to VO2 max to improve it. The same thing with lactate threshold. If here's your threshold, to improve your threshold pace, you run right up against your threshold. There's no reason to run faster than your threshold. Run only as fast as you need to meet the purpose of the workout. And that's very important. That implies that you know what the purpose of the workout is. Most runners and even most coaches have no idea what the purpose of the workout is. You have to understand what the purpose of the workout is, and then you can match the pace to that specific purpose. So again, if your purpose is to train VO2 max, and your VO2 max pace is 6 minutes per mile, then run each half mile rep at 3 minutes per rep. There's no reason to run any faster. So that's one principle of interval training. Another principle is to understand what place in the program the interval workout should have. Nothing is arbitrary, nothing is random if you want to be the best runner you can be. There is a time and a place to do interval workouts. I love how people post on Instagram, they love their Track Tuesday. They love to post their Track Tuesday. Well, you shouldn't be doing a track workout every Tuesday throughout the entire year. Interval training has a specific place in a runner's training program, and it shouldn't come into the program until after you have spent quite a bit of time working on the aerobic development. Because the aerobic development is really what improves a distance runner's performance. Whether you are training for the 1,500 meters or you are training for a marathon, it all starts with the aerobic development. because any race that takes longer than 2 to 3 minutes is more influenced by aerobic metabolism than anaerobic metabolism. So while anaerobic work is important, it's not important until the aerobic base or the aerobic fitness, the aerobic capacity has been fully developed. And that takes many, many months, up to years to do. So that's why, like a freshman in high school who's just coming out for the team for the first time and they've never run before, there's no reason to have them do interval training. You know, there's no reason for that. All you're going to do is stunt their aerobic development, and that's really what's most important. But that's true for adults too. You want to maximize the aerobic development before you start dipping into the interval training. Okay, so let's get to some questions, because I know you probably don't want to hear me talk all the time. So let's get to some questions on here. Anybody have any questions? Oh, maybe not so many questions just yet. There's a bunch of people in the room waving to people. So again, we're doing this both on Facebook and on Instagram. So feel free on Instagram to ask some questions, and we'll keep going talking about interval training. Another thing about interval training is, again, to understand the purpose and make the workouts precise. There's no arbitrary pace when it comes to interval training. As I already said, interval training is a very powerful tool to specifically target the physiological factors that influence running performance. And so whether the goal is to train VO2 max, or to train lactate threshold, or to train anaerobic capacity, or to train anaerobic power, there are specific paces to run at to focus on those specific things. And so, I hear a lot about, people will run at like 5K race pace or 10K race pace, their interval workout. Well, 5K pace or 10K pace or half marathon pace or marathon pace, whatever it is, people like to do workouts that match up with race paces. But it's a weird condition. It just so happens that race paces don't line up with the specific physiological factors that influence those races. So, like marathon pace, there's no benefit to running at marathon pace other than to practice running at marathon pace. So there may be a practical purpose to it, but there's not so much a physiological purpose to it. So the same thing with 5K pace and 10K pace. 5K pace, which seems to be a common and popular pace to run at for interval workouts, doesn't line up with the specific physiological factors that influence 5K running performance. So if you run at 5K pace, well, for most pretty good runners, 5K pace is slower than VO2 max pace, but faster than lactate threshold pace. So you're training in between those two paces. It's kind of like no man's land. What are you trying to improve upon? You're trying to improve VO2 max? Are you trying to improve lactate threshold? You're kind of training in the middle there. And so it's much better if you want to specifically target the physiological factors that influence performance, which is what I suggest you do with your training, then you should specifically match the paces of the workouts to line up with those physiological factors. So if you want to improve your 5K performance, well, you got to improve your threshold, you got to improve VO2 max, you also have to improve anaerobic capacity because there's an anaerobic component to the VO2 max. So you got to address all those different things in a training program, and what time of the year you do those things, and that gets highly technical involved with how you plan the training throughout the year. We'll save that for another episode. But to run an interval workout at 5K pace or 10K pace is kind of a waste of time, because it doesn't specifically target the physiological factors that influence performance for those races. It's better to target the specific physiological factors. And so to give you a general idea, 5K pace is a little bit faster than threshold, well, quite a bit faster than threshold pace for very good runners, and a little bit faster than threshold pace for recreational runners. And so what pace is, you do an interval workout to improve your VO2 max, well, what pace is that? So for pretty good runners, VO2 max pace will be close to 2 mile or 3K race pace. For more recreational type runners, it'll be closer to mile or mile and a half race pace. Think about a race that takes no more than 7 to 10 minutes to complete. A race that takes that long, about 7 to 10 minutes, you're going to be running that race at about 100% of your VO2 max. And so for most runners, it may be closer to a mile and a half race pace. For very good runners, it'll be closer to 2 mile or 3K race pace. For threshold pace, if you're going to do that as an interval workout instead of as a tempo run, threshold pace will be a little bit slower than 5K race pace. It'll be about 20 to 25 seconds slower per mile than 5K race pace. For if you go the other extreme and go the anaerobic side to do a lot of interval training, if you work on anaerobic capacity, anaerobic power, anaerobic capacity for good runners will be about their mile race pace or 1,500 meter race pace. It can even dip down to 800 meter race pace, and then it's getting pretty quick. But that helps improve anaerobic capacity. So you target anaerobic glycolysis as the predominant energy system when you focus on anaerobic capacity training. So anaerobic capacity interval workouts target the energy system of anaerobic glycolysis, the breaking down of glucose anaerobically to give you ATP for muscle contraction. Then you have the fastest speed, which is anaerobic power. And that is the real true speed work when you're really working on maximal speed. And that is nearly all out running. So you just do it for a few seconds. So an interval workout may be, 10 times 100 meters at almost as fast as you can run, taking a long time to recover, to replenish creatine phosphate back in the muscle. So that's the classic sprint type of a workout. You may go 5 to 10 times 50 meters or 5 to 10 times 100 meters, almost as fast as you can, and you take 3 to 5 minutes rest interval in between each one. Whereas anaerobic capacity, you'll take more like a 1 to 2 work to rest ratio. So you may run for 60 seconds at your 800 meter to 1,500 meter race pace, somewhere in that range, and then double the amount of time in recovery as you ran for the hard rep. So maybe go 45 seconds hard and a minute and a half jog recovery. So there's many ways to set up these interval workouts based on what it is you're specifically trying to target. And that's the whole idea behind interval training, to target these specific physiological factors, manipulating the work and the rest, and how much rest do you give for the amount of work. So going back to the VO2 max interval workouts, it would be a 1-to-1 or less than 1 work to rest ratio. So you may run 3 minutes at VO2 max pace, and then take a 2 to 3 minute jog recovery. Keep the recovery active as a jog so that you keep heart rate and volume of oxygen consumed, the VO2, you keep that raised throughout the whole workout. Because the whole goal of the workout is to maximize the cardiovascular, the heart's performance. The heart only has 2 words in its job description: pump blood. And so if you want the heart to become a better pump of that blood and the oxygen carried in that blood, then you have to keep oxygen consumption and heart rate elevated the entire workout. So the recovery interval for a VO2 max workout is active to keep VO2 and heart rate elevated the entire time, so it doesn't drop too far down and then you have to start the next rep from a lower level of VO2 and heart rate. You don't want that. You want to keep it elevated the entire time. If you're just joining us, welcome to Run Talk with Dr. Jason. We broadcast every Monday on Instagram Live, and we're also doing this on Facebook Live. So hello, my Facebook audience. These episodes will be saved on my feed in Instagram every week, so please join us. If you miss an episode, then you can watch it after it's been recorded, and we will try to answer some viewer questions. I see there's some questions on Facebook as well. We'll try to answer those. Stephanie asks, how often would recommend doing interval training? It's a very good question, Stephanie. Again, it depends on the time of the year and how far out from your races you are. So initially, when you first start a training program, very little, if any, emphasis on interval training. It's mostly the aerobic development, and you can do that many ways, through easy runs, through fartleks, through tempo runs, where you don't need to be doing the fast work yet. But then later on in the training program, as the training becomes more specific to focus on the race that you're training for, then you start integrating interval workouts. You start with once a week. And then as you adapt to that, you can add a second one a week. For most runners, 2 a week is enough, not any more than 2 a week. For people who are training multiple times a day and they're doing, close to 14 workouts a week, like Olympians, people who train a lot, they're running 80, 90, 100 miles a week, and they're running twice a day, they can perhaps handle more, but still no more than 3 times a week. Nowhere in empirical evidence and nowhere in the scientific literature do they recommend more than 3 times a week of an interval workout. So that gives you a range, 1 to 3 workouts a week, no more than that. Much more of a runner's training program, even when you are in your speed phase of training. Most of a runner's training program is easy running. And that is because of how important aerobic metabolism is to every race from 1,500 meters all the way up to the marathon. Another question. So for aerobic system development, keep doing easy runs, and when do you know when you are to start anaerobic work? Very good question. That's somewhat of an individual matter, because the thing about the aerobic side is that it is virtually unlimited. And so when do you know when enough is enough? I wrote an article about this for Running Times magazine, which has gone by the wayside. It's a magazine folded. But I wrote this maybe over 10 years ago. I wrote an article called How Much Mileage is Enough? And it tried to answer that question, is to, how much mileage do you need to do? When is enough enough? And so if you look at the training of elite athletes and what they have done over the years, you typically need about 4 to 5 months worth of aerobic development before you start going into the more anaerobic work. Now, having said that, a lot of that depends on where that runner is in their relationship with running. If you are a brand new runner and you've never run before, you need to take more time to do that. You may take a year, especially if you're training for something like a marathon. You may want to take a year to develop yourself aerobically. But if you already have a history of running behind you, then you already have accumulated mileage on your legs, and you're not starting completely from scratch. And so, maybe 4 or 5 months is adequate to develop yourself aerobically before you start doing the anaerobic work. But that's a very difficult question to answer in a general answer, because it depends on the runner. It depends on the history of running that you have on your legs. It depends on your strengths and weaknesses as a runner. If you have a lot of slow twitch muscle fibers where you are really suited for aerobic work, then I would say spend as much time as possible on that, because that's your strength, and minimize the anaerobic work. Only do as much as you need to get that speed in your legs. Whereas someone who's on the other side, who's got a good number of fast twitch fibers, more of a middle distance runner, an 800 meter runner, a 1500 meter runner, then you might start doing the anaerobic work earlier in your program, because that would be your strength. So the answer is it depends on a lot of factors. Your history of running, the length of the race you're training for. Obviously, if you're training for a marathon, you need more aerobic work than if you're training for the 800 meters, although that could be argued that even half-milers still need a considerable amount of aerobic work, not that much less. I mean, people are always surprised when I tell them that, the best milers in the world don't run that many miles less per week than the best marathoners in the world. And so even people who are running a race that takes 4 minutes, if you're an elite miler, then you still need a lot of aerobic development. So to answer your question, Kurt, it's a great question, but to directly answer your question, it depends on how much running you've done in the past and what you're coming into starting your new training program. Where are you coming into that? Are you coming into that with 10 years of running behind you? Are you coming into that with 0 years of running behind you? It depends on how much running you have in your past. It depends on the length of the race you're training for. It depends on your strengths and weaknesses as a runner. And it depends on how much time physically and psychologically you can give to the training program. As I always tell people who train for a marathon in 6 months, if they run, 3 days a week or 4 days a week, training 6 months, running 3 days a week is only half the amount of training as training for 6 months, 6 days a week. So it also depends on how many days a week are you going to run. If you're going to run 3 or 4 days a week, you need to spend more than 5 or 6 months on the aerobic development, because you're only running 3 or 4 days a week, as compared to someone who's running 6 or 7 days a week. They're getting more running in that same 6-month period. So there's a lot of factors that determine the answer to that question. All right, let's see. Any other questions? I find it very difficult to know when I'm in VO2 max zone when I'm running. How do you know when I'm in that zone? Okay, there's a few different ways you can figure out what your correct VO2 max pace is to do the interval workouts correctly. One, and probably the best way, is to determine it off of a recent race. So, there's no races going on right now. If you want to determine what your VO2 max pace is, go to the track or measure out, it has to be precise if you can do this on the road, measure out 2 miles, or do it on the track if you can get to a track, 2-mile time trial. Just run 2 miles as fast as you can, and then from that, you can calculate what your VO2 max pace would be. Because your run rate, the reason why it's always good to get this from a race is because you run races at predictable paces based off of these physiological factors. If I know what your VO2 max pace is, or I know what your lactate threshold pace is, I can predict how fast you're going to run a 5K race or a 10K race or any race distance. The prediction gets less precise when you get into longer races unless you really have the work behind you. Like most runners, if you were to look at their performance across the board, across different races, they're going to be better at the shorter races than the longer because they just don't have the aerobic development to handle the longer races. They're not able to run at a high fraction of their threshold for a long race, or the high fraction of their VO2 max for a long race. But if you have the aerobic work behind you, then you can also predict for the longer races, how fast you're going to run a marathon or half marathon from the VO2 max pace. And very good runners who are very well trained, yes, you can easily predict how fast they're going to run. If you look at like the world record holders in the marathon, the half marathon, you can predict that world record was going to happen based on their workouts. You can predict based on their VO2 max pace, their lactate threshold pace. You can very easily predict how fast they're going to run because it's all predictable. Assuming such things like the weather, you have to account for things like the weather and hills. If there are hills in the race but not in your workout, well, you have to account for things like that. You got to use some common sense and say, well, the race had some hills in it, but the workouts are on a track that are flat. So you have to account for some things like that. But to directly answer your question, if you have a recent race that you've run, then you can calculate from the race. So like I said, for VO2 max pace, it's going to be the fastest pace that can be maintained for about 7 to 10 minutes. If you were to run a race that takes 7 minutes, so it's going to be a little bit slower than 2-mile race pace, or considerably slower than 5K race pace for a recreational type runner. The other way you can do it is by heart rate. Because we know the relationship between VO2 and heart rate, they both increase together. Because when you reach your VO2 max, you reach your maximum heart rate. Because as we talked about in the last episode, the VO2 max equals the stroke volume max times the heart rate max times the max difference in oxygen content between arterial and venous blood. So when we reach our max heart rate, we reach our VO2 max. Those two things happen together. So if you have a heart rate monitor, you can use that to try to monitor whether or not you're reaching your max heart rate during each rep. You may not reach it on the first rep. Depends on how vigorous the warm-up was, and depends on the duration of that first rep. If the first rep is only 3 minutes and your heart rate's not very elevated at the time you start the first rep, then you may not reach on the first rep, but that's okay. That's why we do multiple reps. And that's why we also keep the recovery interval active, so that heart rate doesn't drop too far down before the start of the next rep. So you can do it by calculating from a recent race. You can do it by heart rate. And if you trust yourself and you are very experienced at these kinds of workouts, you can do it by rating of perceived exertion, or how do you feel during the reps. It should feel hard but manageable, whereas lactate threshold workouts feel comfortably hard and high-end aerobic. VO2 max intervals feel hard but still manageable. There is an anaerobic component to training the VO2 max, because VO2 max is above your lactate threshold. So if here's your threshold, VO2 max pace is somewhere over here. So anytime you're running above your threshold, there is an anaerobic contribution to the exercise. And so when you run a VO2 max interval workout, there is some anaerobic metabolism taking place, even though the purpose of the workout is to focus on cardiovascular improvement, to focus on oxygen flow to the muscle, oxygen delivery to the muscle. So even though the purpose is aerobic in nature, there is an anaerobic contribution to running at VO2 max intensity. And so it should feel difficult, but not so hard that you can't repeat a rep and then repeat the rep multiple times. And so that's another way to guide yourself during the VO2 max interval workout. You can calculate it from a race. You can use heart rate, monitoring your heart rate, and try to get it pretty close, if not at your maximum heart rate during each rep. And you can go by feel, knowing that it should feel like it's hard but manageable. Feel like you're running a race that would take you 7 to 10 minutes, but the reps are only going to be about 3 to 4 minutes. So that's why I say it's hard but manageable. Think about a race that would take 7 to 10 minutes to complete, but now you're going to do reps at that pace for only 3 or 3.5 or 4 minutes at a time. 4 minutes would be tough. You know, if you're really elite, you can handle close to a 5-minute rep at VO2 max pace, but for most people, that would be too difficult to go 5 minutes at a time at VO2 max pace. You may only be able to do 2 or 3 reps, and then you're done. So better to keep it closer to the 3-minute range, and then just do multiple reps throughout the workout. Another principle about interval training that most runners and coaches miss is that throw out the number of reps. It doesn't matter. Always do 1 rep at a time and do as many reps as it takes until you cause fatigue, because it's the fatigue that represents the stimulus for improvement. That's what you're trying to improve upon, is you're trying to make adaptations, and you make those adaptations when you are sufficiently fatigued. If the workout doesn't fatigue you, then there's not going to be any reason to adapt to that. You got to think of training as imposing some threat on some aspect of your body's survival. And that's the way we adapt. We adapt to assuage that threat. And so if you go and do a VO2 max interval workout, you're working at your heart's maximum capability for it to do its job. You're working at the max heart rate, the max stroke volume. So if you repeatedly work at your heart's maximum capability for it to do its job, isn't that threatening to the heart as a muscle? Of course it is. And so what do you think your heart's going to do? It's going to say, gee, if I don't make some kind of adaptation, I'm not going to be able to survive. This is going to be dangerous for my life. This is the heart talking. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to increase the size of my left ventricle so it can hold more blood and subsequently pump more blood with each beat. And that is, in my opinion, the most elegant adaptation to training that an endurance athlete makes. Is that we can actually increase the size of our heart, specifically the left ventricle, which is so vitally important because it pumps blood everywhere except for the lungs. And so the left ventricle is already the largest chamber of the 4 chambers of the heart. But you can do workouts to increase the size of that chamber to assuage the threat. Because now, once you have assuaged that threat by making the adaptation, by making a bigger left ventricle, now you're going to have to work even harder to cause that same threat, to cause that same degree of physiological disruption. And that's the whole concept of training. That's the beauty of training, is to systematically impose a series of threats upon some aspect of your body's survival, whether it's a metabolic threat, like when you do the anaerobic capacity workouts and you're causing acidosis, whether it's a metabolic threat or it's a cardiovascular threat, like it is for the VO2 max interval workouts, you're causing some threat on some aspect of your body's survival so that your body responds to that threat and makes adaptations to ultimately assuage that threat, to protect life, whether it's the life of the muscles or the life of the cardiovascular system, or even the life of your neuromuscular system and how muscle fibers are recruited for these different kinds of workouts. There's all kinds of little threats that we impose on aspects of our survival. And that, getting back to that, that's the point of doing the really fast interval workouts, is to focus on anaerobic glycolysis as an energy system and repeatedly drop the pH, cause acidosis. Because when we repeatedly cause acidosis by very fast interval workouts, we assuage that threat, specifically by making more bicarbonate ions, which buffer those hydrogen ions that cause acidosis. So, as you can see here, there's a lot of biochemistry. There is no script for this Run Talk with Dr. Jason show. This is all ad lib. We're just having a conversation, you and me, to talk about training and talk about all things running. So if you're just joining us now, remember to join us every week for an episode of Run Talk with Dr. Jason. Let's get to some viewer questions. How would you count for elevation factors? If you mean elevation and altitude, that's a very good question. And so when you go to altitude, the predominant factor of altitude is that the partial pressure of oxygen in the environment is less because the barometric pressure, the atmospheric pressure, is less. And so molecules move from area of high pressure to low pressure. When you're at sea level, there is an enormous amount of pressure in the air relative to what's in your lungs. And so you have this driving force of oxygen getting from the air into our lungs. The higher up in altitude you go, the smaller that driving force is, because the pressure difference is less and less and less. And so when you go up to high altitude, you don't get as much oxygen in with each breath, because the difference in pressure between your lungs and the environment becomes smaller. So you have to adjust your training. You're not going to be able to do the workouts at the same pace at altitude as you can at sea level for the aerobic workouts. The anaerobic workouts, the anaerobic capacity workouts, and the anaerobic power, the pure speed workouts, you can actually run faster at altitude because those workouts do not depend on oxygen. They depend on other factors related to anaerobic metabolism and muscle fiber recruitment and fast twitch fibers and pure speed. And so because of the less dense air at altitude, you can actually do sprint workouts or any other kind of anaerobic workouts faster at altitude than you can at sea level. But for lactate threshold workouts, if you're going to do that as an interval workout, or for the VO2 max interval workouts, you have to decrease the pace. You have to use your altitude VO2 max pace. And there are ways to, I mean, that's an individual matter too, because some people respond differently to altitude than others. Some people are hurt more by altitude than others. Some people's performance decreases more at altitude than others. And some people respond more to altitude training than others. We have responders and non-responders to altitude. So if you're going to do a workout at altitude, say you do a VO2 max workout at altitude, you have to use your altitude VO2 max. So you would need to have some data at altitude to know what your altitude VO2 max is so that you can calculate what pace you should run for those workouts. But there's also ways to calculate it. Say you're like at 5,000 feet of altitude. Altitude only negatively affects endurance performance when you get to about 3,000 to 3,500 feet. Anything below, like if you're only at 2,000 feet or 1,000 feet, it's irrelevant. It's not going to matter. It's negligible difference on performance. But once you get to about 3,000 to 3,500 feet, then then your VO2 max starts to decrease. And so the workouts need to start to decrease in proportion. And how much it decreases, there are some calculations that you can use, but the best way to know is just to run a race at altitude. Max heart rate will also be slightly less at altitude than it is at sea level as a way to protect the heart, because it would be dangerous to run at your sea level max heart rate when you're at altitude because there's less oxygen available to you. So you have to adjust for the altitude and do your workouts based on what your new altitude VO2 max is or your altitude lactate threshold pace is. Okay, any other questions? I'm loving your explanations. Thank you. I try the best. Like I said, with this show, I said this last episode, I'm going to say this in every single episode. You come to Run Talk with Dr. Jason, and you will get the truth. You go listen to what other coaches and runners post on Facebook or post on Instagram. You're not going to get the truth. No, very few people in this space, unfortunately, have really spent a lot of years studying this. And so even though they think they know, they say things that don't even make any sense. And to the learned observer, it's hard not for me to laugh when I read this stuff, because most people have a very rudimentary understanding of what's going on. So, I decided, at the nudging of a friend, I decided to do these live shows so that we can give people the truth. And I don't care. I'm going to call out other people. I don't care. This is my show. I can do whatever I want. So I'm going to tell you the truth. You want to know the truth. You want to know how to train. If I ever don't know something, if I get a question I don't know, I'll tell you I don't know. I learned that at my PhD qualifying exams, that don't ever try to bullshit your committee members if you don't know the answer to something. If you don't know, you say you don't know, but you go and find out the answer. So I will never act like I know something if I don't know it. I learned that lesson a long time ago the hard way. But you will get the truth when you come and watch Run Talk with Dr. Jason. Every Monday we're going to broadcast this. Okay, what else? We've got some Facebook questions here. Let's see, some Facebook questions and some Instagram questions. We're trying to do this all on Instagram. And we'll do a broadcast on Instagram and Facebook. So try to ask your questions through Instagram, but I'll try to look at both. Does anaerobic contribution mean that energy is being sourced from muscle fibers? Well, your muscle fibers are recruited no matter, even if you're going a slow run. So you're always recruiting slow twitch. Even if you run fast, you always recruit the slow twitch first. If you run easy, then you will only recruit slow twitch. The faster the pace, or more specifically the higher intensity, then you start to recruit more of the other types of fibers, the fast twitch A fibers, and then if you're really sprinting fast, you'll recruit the fast twitch B fibers. And so we have multiple kinds of fibers, but scientists sometimes try to make things easy. Usually scientists try to confuse things, but sometimes they make things easy, and they've categorized these fibers into 3 distinct categories, but there are hybrids in between. So you actually have an array of different kinds of muscle fibers. It's not so neat that they fit into 3 categories, but for the purpose of explanation, we'll make them fit into 3 categories. The slow twitch, which are very good at aerobic metabolism. The fast twitch A, which are a fast twitch, but they also have qualities of aerobic work. And then the fast twitch B, which are your pure anaerobic fibers. And so when you, to answer your question, when you do anaerobic capacity or anaerobic power interval workouts, you will always recruit the slow twitch. You'll also recruit the fast twitch A, and depending on the intensity relative to your maximum sprinting, you might also recruit some fast twitch B. When you're doing the all-out sprint, like when you do the anaerobic power, which focuses on the phosphagen system, energy system, then you will also recruit the fast twitch B, but you'll always recruit the slow twitch first. And that has to do with the resistance to electrical stimulation. You know, in the muscles, the way they get recruited, it's all electrical stimulation. And so because the slow twitch fibers have the lowest firing threshold, they have the least resistance to stimulation, they will always be recruited first. And then you'll recruit others as you need based on the intensity of the activity. So yes, when you go and do the anaerobic workouts, you are recruiting the fast twitch, but metabolism inside those fibers comes from all the different kinds of fibers, the slow twitch, the fast twitch A, and the fast twitch B. But only the fast training will recruit those fast twitch B fibers in order to train those fibers, to train the metabolism inside of those fibers. Any other questions? Let's see what else we got here. Okay, you have to scroll back to find some other questions. We'll try to scroll back. If you're just joining us, welcome to another episode of Run Talk with Dr. Jason. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. There are no commercials, there are no intermission. We just talk. We just have a conversation, you and me. We just talk. I can see you, you can see me. And so today's episode, we're talking all about interval training. So really, there are only 4 speeds at which a runner needs to run. Your easy distance running speed, your lactate threshold speed, your VO2 max speed, and your anaerobic capacity speed. If you are more of a middle distance runner, like 800 meters, 1500 meters, you may also work on the anaerobic power speed. So we'll say there's 5 total speeds. But anaerobic power, the pure all-out sprinting, you know, most people who race a 5K, 10K, half marathon, they're never going to work on that. It's really not that important. The aerobic development is more important. But if you're training for 800 meters or 1500 meters, you have to be fast. You just have to have fast top-end speed. So you also need to dip into the anaerobic power type of work. So that gives you 5 different speeds. 4 of those speeds can be used with interval training. Lactate threshold, you can do that as a continuous run, or you can do it as a series of reps. Like just last night on the track, I did 10 times 800 meters. I didn't know going into the workout how many reps I was going to do. I took them one at a time. I was pretty exhausted by the 10th. I called it a 10. I did 10 times 800 meters at threshold pace with a short 45-second recovery in between. So when you do the threshold as an interval workout, take a very, very short recovery. If you can't repeat the next rep at the exact same pace, then that means you ran too fast. because you should be able to do that off of short recovery, because you could have done it continuously. The benefit of doing an interval workout as opposed to a continuous run to train threshold, or for any workout for that matter, is to accumulate more total work at the given speed. And that's the other principle about interval training. I should have mentioned this a half hour ago, but I'm not reading from a teleprompter, so I'm doing this all off the top of my head. Another benefit of interval training, and the whole purpose of interval training, is that when you take a period of work, a continuous period of work, and you break that period of work up into periods of work and rest and work and rest and work and rest, that enables you to accomplish more total work at a given pace, or even at a faster pace. So for example, you can do 5 times 1,000 meters faster than you can run a 5K race. You can do 10 times 500 meters at a faster pace than you can run 5 times 1,000, even though it's still 5,000 meters. So the smaller the reps, the more total work that you can do at a given pace or even at a faster pace. If you break up 5K race into 100-meter segments, you can run a lot more than 5,000 meters at 5K race pace, or you can run at it faster than 5K race pace. So that's the whole purpose of an interval workout. You take a set amount of work and you break that work up into periods of work and rest and work and rest, and what that enables you to do is to accomplish more total work, more volume than what you would have done at that pace if you were to run it continuously. And that's the whole premise of interval training. And that's why when like people post on Instagram that they do a workout 5 times 1,000 meters at 5K race pace, that's actually not an intelligent workout. Because why do 5 times 1,000 meters at 5K race pace? You could have run 5K continuously at 5K race pace. The whole purpose of an interval workout is to accomplish more total work at a given pace. So if you're going to do 1,000-meter reps, either do them faster than 5K race pace, or, as we talked about before, there's really no reason to run at 5K race pace. But if you're going to run at 5K race pace for the interval workout, then do more than 5 times 1,000. You'd have to do 6 or 7 or 8 times 1,000 to meet the purpose of an interval workout. Either run more total distance at the given pace that you could have run continuously, or run it faster. And so that's the whole premise of interval training. That's why I said before, most people get this wrong because they don't understand the purpose of an interval workout. When you truly understand what it is you're trying to accomplish, then that empowers you. That gives you the ability to then design workouts that are going to meet the specific purpose, and you start training more intelligently than everybody else. And that's how you're going to become a better runner. So let's go back to that example. If you're going to do a workout at 5K race pace, then you need the interval workout to be, the total work has to be more than 5,000 meters to get the real benefit of that work, because otherwise it's no longer a stress. Because if you're taking recoveries in between, but you're still running at 5K race pace, but you could have done that continuously. See how that doesn't make sense? You're right, Jason, that doesn't make sense. Oh, I'm glad you think so. So either run it faster than 5K race pace, or do more work. Run 6 or 7 or 8 times 1,000 meters at 5K race pace. But as we talked about before, there's really no reason to do the work at a 5K race pace anyway, because it's too fast to train your lactate threshold, and it's too slow to train VO2 max. So it's better to do, if you can do 1,000-meter reps, it's better to do it at closer to 3K race pace. So you're doing considerably faster than 5K race pace to really target VO2 max. And so you may do 5 times 1,000 meters at 3,000-meter race pace. Now that's a hard workout. Okay, what else do we got here? Let's see if there's any more questions. Feel free to ask some questions. We got a lot of people in the house, I see. It's always great to have a studio audience. Maybe one day I will have a show next door to Dr. Oz or Dr. Phil, and then I'll be broadcast all over the world. In the meantime, we're going to broadcast to Instagram and try also to do it through Facebook. Looks like we're still live on Facebook. Hi, Facebook. Hi, Instagram. And every week we're going to talk about some factor that will influence your running performance to help you be a better runner. Because that's what runners want, right? Everybody wants to run faster and avoid injuries. Sometimes we'll have a guest on the show, and other times it'll just be me. But we shoot straight on Run Talk with Dr. Jason. There's no fluff here. There's no misunderstandings here. It's just you and me having a conversation, and we're going to learn together how to be a better runner. Let's see. It's 10 to 1 Pacific time. I think we've done a good job of talking about interval training, the history of interval training, the benefits of interval training, how to design an interval workout, and hopefully you will be empowered now to design interval workouts correctly to get the benefit of each one. At the end of each show, we're going to close with some thoughts. And so my thought for today is, again, similar to my thought for last week. You know, as we're starting to open up society and get back to work, remember that we are animals first, and we live a physical life. And so when you go out the door every day to run, remember that when you run, you are fulfilling your destiny as a physical being, and on the foundation of a fitter physical being, you can build a better life. Thank you for joining us. Come back next week for another episode of Run Talk with Dr. Jason. Bye for now.